Andrew Carnegie and Colonel Piper were partners in a bridge company, and they went to St. Louis to collect payment for a bridge. But Piper was feeling homesick and wanted to go back to Pittsburgh. Carnegie, knowing that Piper was completely obsessed with horses, told him that he was planning to buy some of St. Louis's finest horses as a gift for his sister, and that he needed Piper to pick them. And that was enough. Piper was suddenly eager to remain in St. Louis, whereas before he had been eager to leave it. People have different interests and motives. For Colonel Piper, horses captured his attention and could be used to control his behavior. Colonel Piper cared about collecting payment on the bridge and profiting his company, but he cared more about going back to Pittsburgh. If Carnegie had presented an argument with themes of money, business, and duty, it probably wouldn't have influenced Piper. Like, we have a lot of money on the line. You have an obligation to help us collect this debt. Saying something like that wouldn't have appealed to Piper's interests and motives or captured his attention. In trying to influence Piper to stay in St. Louis and collect payment on the bridge, Carnegie didn't focus on the actual mission and discuss it with Piper. He didn't argue that Piper had a duty to stay in St. Louis. He didn't mention how they had a lot of money on the line. None of those things would have been enough to take Piper's attention off of his longing to go back to Pittsburgh. Because again, returning to Pittsburgh meant more to him than collecting payment for the bridge. So Carnegie looked beyond the business and duty angle. He used Piper's bizarre interest in horses to get him to stay in St. Louis and complete their business objectives. Piper wanted to make money, fulfill his duty, and help Carnegie, but he was more focused in on how he missed his hometown of Pittsburgh. And his interest in horses trumped all of those things. He cared more about horses than his homesickness, and more about his homesickness than profits, duty, and his obligation to Carnegie. So, Carnegie used horses instead of anything pertaining to the actual business and Piper's duties to the business. Is it rational and sensible for a man to care more about horses than homesickness, and more about homesickness than his business? Most people would say no. But Carnegie didn't care about that. He didn't think, Piper should think, feel, and act according to what I consider rational and sensible. If I tell him that business is more important than going back to Pittsburgh, he should agree with me and go along with my plan. In Colonel Piper's world, most things are secondary to horses. That's Piper's world. It doesn't matter how in most of the rest of the world, it would be absurd to rank horses so high above so many other things. Colonel Piper isn't most of the rest of the world. Colonel Piper is Colonel Piper. Carnegie thought Colonel Piper was Colonel Piper. He isn't like me or like most of the rest of the world. He doesn't share my standards of what's rational or sensible. He'd rather go back to Pittsburgh than stay in St. Louis and collect the debt. But he'd rather track down St. Louis's best horses than go back to Pittsburgh. If I talk to him about business profits or appeal to his sense of duty or obligation, I might not be able to capture his attention and change his behavior. If I talk to him about horses, I can get him to do almost anything. That's how Piper's world works. That has to do with his interests and motives. That's what captures his attention. If I want to influence Piper, I have to account for his world and not expect it to be similar to my world or everyone else's world. People have different interests and motives. For Colonel Piper, horses capture his attention and could be used to control his behavior. For others, it's something else altogether. Football player Lawrence Taylor once said that at one point in his life, after his retirement from football, he lived a life that revolved around prostitutes and cocaine, and that during that time, if you weren't an addict, dealer, or hooker, he didn't want to know you. Those things were what captured his attention, and they could be used to control his behavior. Some people are into works of fine art, and others don't care about that at all. Some are obsessed with politics, and others don't even know who the vice president is. Some are always intent on making a point and telling others what they should do, and others have a much different attitude. Some women will be obsessed with noting the cost of another woman's clothing and jewelry, while other women will pay much less attention to something like that. Some women will be sucked into any conversation. Some people will be sucked into any conversation, television program, or article that mentions Israel, while others might not even care about Israel enough to know if it's in the middle of a war. One person spends hours a day gossiping about people in her social circle, while another spends hours a day studying science. One Christian might be obsessed with converting atheists to his religion, while another Christian might be obsessed with helping the needy. The typical Lebanese American will be very interested in comedy in a comedy act about Lebanese Americans and find it very funny, but the typical Indonesian American won't share his enthusiasm about Lebanese American themed comedy.